Lucas had always feared the dark, but tonight, in the abandoned hospital, his fear became reality. Beside him, Mara's eyes widened in silent terror as the shadows shifted, and a presence he couldn't see whispered his name. Every step they took seemed to pull them deeper into a nightmare where the living and the dead were no longer separate, and where escaping meant forgetting who they once were. This is the story of what happens when death doesn't release you. It follows you. I woke to a smell that made my stomach churn, sharp and sterile, like bleach mixed with something decaying. My eyes opened slowly, and the first thing I noticed was the cold. It pressed against my skin in a way that was almost unbearable, making every movement feel heavy and wrong. I tried to lift my arms, but they moved sluggishly, as if my body wasn't entirely my own. The ceiling above me was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering with a rhythm that made my head spin. I couldn't remember how I got here, or even who I really was. The room was small, almost too small. There was a metal table in the center, and I realized I was lying on it. The edges of the table bit into my skin, cold and unyielding. My heart, or at least the rhythm I felt inside me, was uneven, a hollow drum that didn't seem to belong to a living person. I tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came out. My lips moved, my throat worked, but the air remained still. A thin layer of frost seemed to be creeping across the floor. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, darker than the faint gray of the walls, and I could feel them watching me. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled. They trembled under a weight that wasn't mine. The reflection in the small glass window of the door caught my eye. I froze. The face staring back at me was pale, too pale, with dark patches beneath the eyes that looked like bruises. But I had never felt pain there. My own reflection twisted slightly, like it was alive, studying me with empty eyes. A sound made me jerk my head toward the far corner of the room. It was soft, almost inaudible at first, like someone breathing behind a thick curtain. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on my chest. My own breaths felt labored, shallow, as if each inhale was stolen from me by something unseen. I wanted to move, to run, but the body beneath me refused to obey. It shivered on its own, twitching in ways that made my skin crawl. And then I saw it. My name, scrawled in what looked like fresh blood on the wall. The letters were jagged, uneven, dripping in slow, deliberate trails. I had not moved. No one else had been in the room. My thoughts raced, panic clawing at me from the inside, but my body stayed frozen, unresponsive. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward the writing, stretching like fingers that wanted to pull me into the wall. I tried to blink, to convince myself it was a hallucination, but the more I stared, the more real it became. My name, carved into the surface like a warning, seemed to pulse slightly, as if alive. The air smelled even worse now, metallic and sweet, and I realized with a jolt that the shadows were moving closer, inching silently along the walls. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but my body stayed where it was. And then I understood. I was not here by chance. Whatever this place was, it had been waiting for me. I ran, or at least I tried. Each step felt wrong, my legs dragging through invisible resistance, like wading through thick mud that had no bottom. The corridors twisted around me in impossible ways, bending back on themselves so that every turn led me straight to the same room I had tried so desperately to leave behind. The room with my lifeless body lying on the metal table. Each time I saw it, a cold weight settled in my chest, a crushing reminder that whatever I was, it wasn't alive. The body stared up at the ceiling, eyes wide and empty. The skin was pale, unnervingly perfect, almost untouched by decay, and yet when I looked closer, I saw faint lines forming under the skin, black, vein-like patterns crawling like ink spilling across paper. My own body twitched, almost in sympathy, and I realized with a shock that the lines were spreading on me, too. Something invisible was creeping through me, pulling at the edges of what I thought was my identity. A shadow fell across the doorway. I didn't see it enter, but I felt it immediately, tall, impossibly thin, limbs stretching in unnatural ways, covered in stitches that writhed like living threads. Its head tilted to one side, studying me in silence. I wanted to look away, to hide, but my eyes were fixed on it, paralyzed by some force I couldn't name. The air around it smelled of rot and metal, a stench that seeped into my mouth and lungs, coating my insides with fear. I moved backward, barely aware of my own steps, and the room itself seemed to pulse, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, breathing me in and out. The lights flickered violently, and when they went out completely, I felt the stitched figure move closer, unseen but undeniable. Every nerve ending in my body screamed at me to run, yet my body refused, frozen in the center of that living nightmare. Then I heard it, the sound of my own voice, low at first, echoing softly from the table where my lifeless form lay. It grew louder, raw, and distorted, like a scream trapped in metal. My heart, or the hollow thing that tried to beat in my chest, skipped violently. The voice called my name again and again, desperate, pleading, taunting. I wanted to flee, but the moment I turned toward the door, it disappeared. Not the sound, the body itself. I stumbled forward, hands brushing against the table, and saw something impossible. My own body lifted slightly, trembling, reaching toward me with cold, rigid fingers. The eyes were wide open now, staring directly at me, and in that frozen gaze was a knowledge I couldn't bear, the understanding that the body was aware that it had been waiting for me and that I could never leave without it. The stitched figure returned, appearing behind me in a flash of darkness, leaning close as if to inspect me. Its stitched mouth twitched, forming a grin that felt alive, watching, knowing more than I ever could. My reflection, or what was left of it, shifted in the corner, twisting in agony, and I realized with a sinking horror that I had become part of something far larger than myself, something I could not escape. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the room went silent. My voice stopped. The body froze. The figure vanished. Only the smell of rot lingered, crawling into every corner of my mind, reminding me that I was no longer whole. Somewhere, unseen, something was still learning me, step by step, thought by thought, preparing for the moment it would take the rest of me. I became aware that I was no longer moving on my own. Something guided me, tugging me through the endless corridors as if I were a puppet on invisible strings. The walls closed in and stretched out at the same time, narrowing like the throat of a tunnel and then widening into spaces that shouldn't exist. The air grew thick and heavy, sticky with a cold dampness that clung to my skin. Every step felt wrong, as though I were walking through someone else's memories, each one twisting into nightmares I didn't understand but somehow knew were mine. I stumbled into a room filled with mirrors. Hundreds of them, covering every surface, reflecting infinite versions of myself. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were drawn to the reflections like moths to a flame. One face was pale and trembling, hollowed-out eyes staring into nothing. Another twisted into a grotesque grin, too wide, too cruel. Yet another dripped black liquid from the mouth, dark and viscous, crawling down the reflection's chin as if it were alive. I reached out to touch one mirror, desperate to shatter it and escape, but my hand passed through as if the glass were water. The reflections didn't mirror my movements. They acted independently, their eyes following me, their mouths twisting in silent mockery. I realized then that they weren't showing me. They were showing what I had become, or perhaps what I had been all along, hollow, empty, and disconnected from life. A movement caught my eye. Behind one of the mirrors, the stitched figure appeared, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It leaned closer, tilting its head as though examining me, studying the threads of my existence with patience that chilled me to the core. I spun around, hoping to confront it, but the room was empty. Only the mirrors remained, reflecting versions of me I didn't recognize, each one whispering my name in voices that weren't mine. I stumbled forward, and as I did, I realized the reflection of my lifeless body on the table from before had appeared in one of the mirrors. Its eyes were wide open now, staring at me with a mix of fear and warning. The lips of the reflection moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. I was not meant to escape. I was not meant to live. The stitched figure reappeared suddenly, stepping into the reflection instead of the room itself. Its shadow stretched, reaching through the mirror toward me, distorting and bending the glass like liquid. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted, as if the floor itself were holding me. My breath caught in my throat, or rather, the hollow space where breath should have been, and panic clawed at me with sharp, invisible talons. Then I saw it, for the first time fully. My body, the one lying in that cold room, was no longer lying still. Its head had turned, and its eyes, dead yet burning with awareness, were following me. I wanted to scream, but the sound never came. I wanted to run, but the corridors had disappeared, replaced by infinite mirrors, reflecting infinite horrors. The stitched figure tilted its head again, and the black threads along its limbs writhed, inching toward me. And then the mirrors began to crack, faint spiderweb lines spreading across the glass. Behind every crack, countless eyes stared, and from each one came a whisper. "You cannot leave. You will never leave." I stumbled into the final room without realizing I had moved. The corridors I had been trapped in for what felt like hours or days had vanished, leaving only darkness. The air was thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like a solid weight. In the center of the room, faint light glowed from a coffin, its surface smooth and cold, reflecting nothing but shadows. My body, or the version I had believed mine, lay inside, perfectly still, pristine, untouched by the horrors I had witnessed. The stitched figure knelt beside it, its head cocked as if examining a specimen. Its threads writhed gently, almost contemplatively, as though it were savoring the moment. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but no sound came from me. The hollow shell I inhabited could not produce life. It could only move, shudder, and watch. I leaned toward the coffin, compelled by some force I did not understand, and the body inside shifted. Its hand lifted slowly, rigid and deliberate, reaching toward me. I recoiled, but my own hand passed right through it, as if I were nothing, a ghost tethered to a world I no longer belonged to. The stitched figure vanished in a blur of darkness, leaving the coffin illuminated in eerie silence. I felt a pull, magnetic and undeniable, drawing me closer to my own corpse. The face inside the coffin stared back at me, eyes wide, empty, and yet somehow aware, knowing. There was a quiet message in that gaze, one I could not fully understand but felt deep in my hollow chest. I was already dead, and this was only the beginning. A sound came then, faint at first, like whispered breaths against metal. I turned, but there was nothing, only darkness and the faint glow of the coffin. And yet the whispers continued, growing louder, echoing in my mind. "You were never alive. You were never whole. You cannot leave." My body shivered, though there was no air to carry the cold, and I realized with horror that the stitched figure had never truly left. It was here, in the shadows, in the cracks of the floor, in the walls themselves, learning, mimicking, waiting. I sank to my knees, unable to move, unable to think, except to feel the suffocating truth of my existence. The coffin creaked, the lid sliding open just a fraction. My body inside twitched, rose slightly, and for a brief instant, I thought it might reach out to me fully. Then it paused, hand hovering over my hollow self, and the light dimmed, leaving me in near total darkness. My heartbeat, or what I thought had been a heartbeat, stopped entirely. I was alone, but I was not alone, and then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was no longer the living observer. I was the shadow, the hollow echo, trapped in a world of bodies that had already left, corpses that knew me better than I knew myself. Somewhere, in the darkness beyond, another presence stirred. Another version of me, waiting, learning, preparing to step into the world I had thought was mine. I tried to move toward it to escape, but the floor gave way to emptiness. There was no sound, no breath, no light, only the pull of something ancient and patient. I felt myself falling, not into a place, but into awareness that I would never leave. And somewhere, in the shadows, a whisper, my own voice or someone else's, called out, "You belong here now, forever." The room, the coffin, the stitched figure, all disappeared. And I was left, hollow, suspended, a witness to a world that had already forgotten me, yet never would.